What if I told you that 2026 was going to be more medieval than 1326, 1226, or any other year in the actual Middle Ages? Well, you'd probably be wondering what I mean by that. In a previous video, I talked about how the 2020s are the new Middle Ages, and we're repeating a lot of the same trends as our medieval ancestors, except this time they're playing out on this massive global scale. 2026 looks like it's going to be the year that this trend really comes together for better or worse. I mean, just look at how medieval 2025 was. I'm sure you've heard about the birth rate crisis that is facing most developed countries right now, but what nobody told you is that Mongolia was one of the few countries in 2025 to actually have a super healthy birth rate. That's all fine and dandy now, but in a few decades we could be facing a new Genghis Khan. Deep down, we always knew the Mongol Empire would rise again. There have also, of course, been these ongoing proxy wars in Ukraine and Gaza, and it's starting to look like World War III is going to resemble the 100 Years' War instead of the all-out, simultaneous global conflict we saw in World War II. You had the election of an American Pope from my hometown of Chicago, which reminded me a lot of the election of Adrian IV in 1154, the only English Pope in history. You could also look at the 2025 New York City race for mayor. You have Zohran Mamdani, a guy who feels, at least to me, less like a traditional politician and more like a tribune of the plebs from a 14th century Italian commune. For context, in the Middle Ages, when the local lords got too greedy and the infrastructure started to rot, the people formed communes to take their city back. There was quite a lot of urban unrest in the late Middle Ages, and the average person started to realize that their voice meant something too. You can't forget this past year there was also the assassination of Charlie Kirk on a college campus, which is supposed to be a safe space for the exchange of ideas. That whole thing reminded me a little bit of the murder of Thomas Becket, although Kirk was of course not a clergyman or a saint. He was an influential and controversial figure, as was Thomas, and just like Charlie, Thomas was also killed in a so-called safe space. He was brutally hacked to death in Canterbury Cathedral, and in the Middle Ages, churches were supposed to be these violence-free zones. However, if you know anything about medieval history, you probably know this was rarely actually observed. So now we've established that 2025 looked pretty medieval, so what can we expect in this coming year? As I mentioned in a previous video, the last decade plus has been all about minimalism and corporate gray. It seems to be everywhere, from our tech to our apartments to our crappy Uniqlo clothing that only comes in beige and off-white. I think at this point we're all sick of it, which is why maximalism is poised to make a huge comeback, and nothing is more medieval than maximalism. These videos have mostly become me rambling about articles I read recently, so let's discuss this article I read in the New York Times not too long ago called Out with the Beige and Boring. The author Harris Reed talks about how the 2025 global runway season gave the first hints of a turn towards something bigger and more beautiful and more colorful. For the first time in forever, many of the models wore flamboyant clothing with wild patterns instead of dressing like Kanye in that one music video. Interestingly, Harris writes, and I quote, "Fundamentally, I believe people crave depth. We're searching for genuine vulnerability and transparency for an unfiltered story. In the age of endless social media feeds, this search now manifests as a collective shift away from the glossy, perfected narrative carefully built and curated by public relations firms. Instead, we are turning towards authenticity." Aha! That's exactly what I said in my 2030s Renaissance video. Clearly, my ideas are incredibly influential. In the era of AI and endless tech, we're craving something human, and maximalism scratches that itch. It doesn't necessarily mean consumerism or just buying things that are physically large. It means paying attention to detail and doing what's loud and proud without fear of being judged. It turns out, of course, that we're just rediscovering something that our medieval ancestors already knew. There was a concept in the Middle Ages called horror vacui, or fear of the empty. It was basically this urge to fill every square inch of a manuscript or a cathedral wall with detail, and it's the first thing you'll notice if you look at pretty much anything from medieval Europe. It came from a belief that beauty was a moral imperative. So if a space was empty or boring, it was actually a waste of God's creation. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about the medieval mindset. Get more medieval. Value beauty and humanity again. We might be reliving the Middle Ages, but a lot of super cool stuff happened during the Middle Ages, so get going. Anyway, we can look to Abbot Suger of Saint Denis from the 12th century, basically the father of the Gothic. He argued that the dull mind can only rise to truth through that which is material. Suger and many other medieval Catholics like him believed that looking at gold and art and stained glass was actually a technology for the soul to reach higher consciousness, which is why medieval cathedrals are so breathtakingly beautiful. By the 14th century, the International Gothic style had taken over Europe, easily recognizable because it was defined by excessive detail, elongated figures, and obsession with luxury fabrics and paintings. The most famous example is probably the Books of the Hours that were beautifully illustrated by the Limburg brothers. Every page pretty much explodes with blue and gold and intricate scenes of castles and feasts. This also made me wonder where blue pigment came from in medieval Europe, and it came from crushed lapis lazuli, so there's a fun fact for you. My favorite example of insane medieval maximalism actually comes from a painting called The Madonna of Chancellor Roland by my absolute favorite late medieval / early Renaissance painter, Jan van Eyck. On the left, Roland kneels in prayer, and on the right, the Virgin Mary balances the infant Christ on her knee. Pretty stock religious artwork, right? Not quite. Look at what's in the middle. It's the city of Autun in Burgundy, Roland's hometown, and it is rendered in extreme detail for no specific reason. Seriously, when you zoom in, you can see how much time Van Eyck spent making sure every roof and spire was exactly right, creating this mind-blowingly complex urban landscape that can barely even be seen by the naked eye when you're just standing in front of the painting and looking at it. Details matter, folks, and details are going to be a big part of how we parse the real from the AI in the next few years. People are already catching on to this, and next time you see a suspicious video of Donald Trump dunking a basketball, check how many fingers are on his hands. I'm not sure why generative AI struggles so much specifically with fingers. Please let me know in the comments. I could just look it up, but Google gives AI answers now, and I want to start crowdsourcing knowledge again. I was trying to process some trends I think we're going to see in the next 12 months, especially those that might link us back to the Middle Ages, and the more I brainstormed, the more similarities I saw. Before we do that, just a quick plug. If you like my content, which of course you do, you should definitely join my Patreon, link in the description. You'll get access to the official Medieval Mindset podcast with weekly episodes, the Medieval Mindset book club, voting rights on topics and titles and thumbnails, the essential medieval history reading list, special videos that don't get posted on my main channel. So sign up now, and if you're not subscribed to this channel, go ahead and do that as well. Back to the video. For one, the whole main character energy thing is huge right now, especially as more and more people lose faith in the institutions that we once held dear. Research is showing that young fans these days are more drawn to a sport by an athlete rather than by a team, and you see the same thing in music. Maybe I'm just out of touch, but with the exception of K-pop, I feel like bands aren't really a thing anymore. People invest their whole personality into individual artists these days and will go to any lengths to defend them when they are inevitably accused of something rather untoward. I'm a huge fan of the UFC, and my algorithm is constantly inundated with these like slow motion stylized edits of popular fighters hitting crazy knockouts with this music in the background, and all of the comments are talking about how much aura that fighter has. In fact, a lot of the fighters have even started their own YouTube channels that aren't affiliated with the UFC, which is just one small example of how control is slowly being taken away from institutions, and now individuals like yours truly can independently build an audience online. It's sort of similar to the death of feudalism in the late Middle Ages and the rise of the mercantile class. At the same time, our society is becoming less and less religious, at least in the mainstream, but even if you get rid of religion, the human tendencies involved with the religion will just need to find a home elsewhere. The whole main character energy, cult of personality thing online, even with influencers and Twitch streamers and whoever else is dominating your algorithm, sure reminds me a lot of the medieval veneration of saints. You might be sighing and rolling your eyes right now, but I love nothing more than stretching modern trends to fit medieval history, so just bear with me. Saints were a massive deal in medieval Catholicism. They're still a big deal in modern Catholicism, but I don't even think we can imagine the outsized role they played in the faith of your average medieval Catholic. Your earthly life was thought of as a sort of pilgrimage, and the lives of the saints were these incredible examples of resistance to temptation and evil, and heroic faith and virtue, and they were used to teach and encourage and inspire. Saints were, and still are, also thought of as intercessors, basically meaning they could add a little extra oomph to your spiritual petitions. If you'll forgive my clunky modern analogy, saints really were the influencers of the medieval world, and they only grew in influence as the Middle Ages went on. Just look at St. Francis of Assisi, who was so goated that he essentially sparked a spiritual revolution single-handedly. He popularized preaching in the vernacular, his ideas led to popular art starting to depict more of the human suffering of Christ, he provided a rule of life for ordinary people to live out gospel values while remaining in their homes and jobs and not having to run off to a monastery. There's this TikToker named Charlie Kirk, and her whole shtick is basically that she's a very sweet Southern mom and teacher who eats these diabolical food combinations on her lunch break. She'll put pickles inside of an onion slice covered with marmalade, or most popularly, she'll slice open a cooked sweet potato and put a piece of Butterkäse inside, which is a soft German cheese. Bear with me, I promise this is going somewhere. At least as far as I can tell, Courtney never set out to be a capital I influencer, and yet she's become so popular that when she started doing the Butterkäse sweet potato thing, grocery stores across the country sold out of Butterkäse. There's a million other examples of influencers having a similar effect, sometimes even a nefarious effect, like all of the streamers who have been promoting online gambling to minors. But anyway, the point here is that this cult of the individual, even inside the parameters of a large institution, is a very medieval concept that has only recently become big again. Sure, you had movie stars and rock stars in the 20th century, but this is something different, and the trends show that individual creators will continue to grow and sway in 2026. But I've rambled enough on this topic, let's make another medieval modern connection before we close things out. As I've addressed in other videos, there's a real cultural feeling of doom and gloom right now, at least in the United States. Billionaires keep getting richer, groceries keep getting more expensive, and we continue our gradual march towards some bizarre form of digital neo-feudalism. All you have to do is open TikTok or Reddit and you'll see tons of people making videos of themselves in their cars talking about how terrible everything is getting. Can someone please explain to me what the car thing is all about? And how come these mukbangers online are always eating in their car? That seems like the absolute worst place to spill something. Anyway, suffice to say, people are upset, and I think we all feel like nothing could possibly get worse. There's an important medieval concept we've all forgotten, the idea of Fortune's Wheel. I'm not talking about the game show Wheel of Fortune, although I assume that's where it got its name. Somebody please confirm for me in the comments. Basically, Fortune's Wheel in the Middle Ages was this incredibly popular motif that you see mentioned constantly in literature and depicted in art, like this medieval mural in this Swedish church. The concept actually originated in ancient Babylon, but it was absorbed into Western medieval thought by Boethius. Boethius was one of the most influential thinkers of the entire Middle Ages, and he basically blended Christian and pagan concepts to cook up the idea of fortune as a power completely subservient to God. But what does all of this mean to us, you ask? My motto for the year is tutto passa, mostly because of this Italian guy's sick chest tattoo I saw on TikTok. It means everything passes, or the sentiment in English most commonly rendered as this too shall pass. So during the good times, enjoy them because this too shall pass, and during the bad times, don't lose hope because this too shall pass. This is literally one of the cornerstones of medieval thought, and by the late Middle Ages, it had formed into the idea of memento mori, remember that you shall die. Basically, no matter how rich and powerful and influential you are on Earth, we all end up as worm food in the same ground, so act accordingly. Getting back to my main point, the overarching concept here is of course Fortune's Wheel. It's literally how history functions, and Geoffrey Chaucer famously used it as the basis for his Monk's Tale, describing how great historical figures like Nebuchadnezzar and Nero and Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar were brought to the pinnacle of success by Fortune's Wheel and then were crushed under it when their fortunes changed. The point is that life and our world are transitory and ever-changing. Just because things are a certain way now doesn't mean they always will be. During the Black Death, the level of death and destruction was so mind-boggling that contemporary chroniclers thought it was literally the biblical apocalypse as foretold by John in the book of Revelation. Spoiler, it wasn't, and even today, anytime there's a troubling event or development in the world, you have the doomsayers claiming that everything is coming to an end. Seems like not much has changed in the human psyche in the last 700 years as much as we like to think it has. Anyway, let's land the plane here. While we might be living smack dab in the middle of the most medieval period since the actual Middle Ages, that isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. For one, there were several mini renaissances during the Middle Ages, like the Carolingian Renaissance or the 12th century Renaissance. People associate the word medieval with mud and blood and illiteracy, but the actual historical truth is much more rich and vibrant. You can either succumb to doom and gloom gloom like a medieval street preacher, or you can remember that fortune's wheel will always keep spinning. What goes up must come down, and what comes down must inevitably at some point go up again. In the meantime, you should be as medieval as possible. Be daring in your fashion sense. Be needlessly intricate in your home decor. Don't believe everything you hear on the internet, even if it comes from a so-called influencer. Prepare yourself for the new Mongol hordes that will sweep across the world in the 2040s. And above all, don't let it get you down, it's only castles burning. But what do you think? Will 2026 be more medieval than 2025, or are we already moving into something like a complete cultural rebirth? Let me know in the comments. As always, I'm John, this has been Medieval Mindset, and remember, the past isn't gone, it's simply waiting to be rediscovered.